I've decided to stand here because otherwise you're not going to see me. I had the same problem last year, and unfortunately, no, the last care, and I haven't grown. Maybe next time. But I wanted to start the talk with a question, and it's a question to you. Why do you think that some groups achieve more than other groups? Just, have a quick thought in your mind. What do you think it comes down to? Like when I ask myself this, or when I ask my friends, quite often answers like intelligence, maybe the amount of money they have, the social stability of the communities that these people live in, maybe a university degree. To be honest, I think all of these things probably contribute. But there's also one thing that I think people quite often overlook, and that is organisational culture. And trying to answer this question, a person, an engineer / designer, he decided that he wanted to design some kind of experiment to test these ideas. And what he did was this. Maybe some of you have already heard of it. He designed this challenge, essentially, called the Marshmallow Challenge. And the aim of taking part in this challenge was to build the tallest possible structure in 20 minutes using only 20 pieces of uncooked spaghetti, 1 meter of tape, 1 meter of string, and 1 marshmallow that has to be on the top. They're the rules. What he did was he took people, different groups of people, to test how well they fared in this experiment. And quite a lot of the people taking part were business school students. So he took people from universities like Stanford, California, Tokyo, and had them complete this challenge. And, how big do you think they got this structure? There's probably a lot of things that contribute to this. And one of the things that I didn't tell you is that some of the people taking part in the challenge were actually school children as well. And what did the business school students do when you observed them taking part in this challenge? You could see them strategizing. They were talking to each other, looking at the materials, testing them, giving suggestions, getting feedback, and in essence, trying to strategize. Compare that with the school kids. How did they approach this? Well, when you looked at them, you could see that they did not strategize. They didn't talk together about how best to approach this problem. In fact, they barely talked at all. What they did do is stand really close together and just grab the things and start testing. Now, you've probably figured out by now why I put this in here, this example. And essentially, I wanted to highlight what you can do with a good group structure. These kids, actually, let's start with the business school students. From the outside, you can see they may look effective. They may look like they're collaborating. But actually, what they're doing is engaging in status management. They're asking each other questions like, who's in charge here? Is it okay if I criticize that other person's idea? What are people going to think of me if I get something wrong? The school kids, on the other hand, they look from the outside to be inefficient. But as a single entity, they operate very effectively. So who won? I mean, it's kind of obvious with my example now, but the school kids won. They built towers of about average 56 centimeters, and the business school students, maybe 25, something like this. And clearly, this is not me standing here saying you don't need to strategize, you don't need to talk to each other. It's not even about, you know, you don't need to go to university or anything. It's more, these kids were not smarter. They didn't have more intelligence than the business school students. But they did work together in a smarter way. And this, the reason I included this here, it's not a scientific experiment, it's just a nice example to try and, you know, kick off some kind of understanding about what culture is. And we're going to talk about that some more, about group culture and organizational culture. These are the school kids. You can see them with their towers. I don't know, I just really like these pictures. They seem really happy. But who am I? Why am I stood here, and why should you even be here listening to me? Do I know what I'm talking about? I'm not sure, to be honest. But well, as you can see, I work for Anima International. I've been a full-time animal advocate now for 10 years. I've worked in 3 animal advocacy organizations. I've volunteered in 2. And I founded one of my own. What all this can translate into is that I've seen a lot of things and I've made a lot of mistakes. And hopefully I can share some of that with you today in this presentation. So we're going to start with part 1. There's only 2 parts, don't worry. And we'll kick off with culture. Start with something simple. What is culture? I took this definition from Wikipedia because I thought it really summed up what I wanted to get across. That culture is this umbrella term which encompasses the social behavior, institutions, and norms found in human societies, as well as the knowledge, beliefs, arts, laws, customs, capabilities, and habits of the individuals in these groups. So it's a lot. I was preparing for this talk, and I looked up the etymology of the word culture. And what I actually found was it comes from a Latin word, meaning to tend, to till, to cultivate. And nowadays, that is very frequently used, these kinds of words, in farming, in agriculture. You cultivate the soil, for example. And this made me think, this word culture, it can really represent something like this. You could easily define it as preparing the ground so that you can grow efficiently. And that's actually what we're trying to do at the moment in Anima International. We're trying to build the foundation upon which we can then quickly scale rapidly in the future. So culture is very much this foundation on which you build everything else. One of my colleagues said to me when we were talking about, organizations, culture, and so on, that building an organization is very much like building a city. It's often very chaotic. It can have, it's very chaotic, you can make a lot of mistakes, and for sure we have. But at the same time, at some point, you're going to have a set of social norms, some agreed upon rules, and ways that people do things. Luckily, building an organization is slightly easier than building a city, and we can get there quicker by understanding what culture actually is. I'm going to talk very briefly about this idea of culture and civilization, just to explain my thoughts behind culture a little bit more. So we've got two examples here. We've got ancient Rome, first of all. What was the culture of ancient Rome like? They were very into hierarchy. I mean, you can see it all throughout Roman society, even in where people sat in the Colosseum during public games, for example. Part of the Roman culture also was things like religion, consequentialism, virtue, duty, and philosophy. That's what you needed to engage with if you were going to be one of these cultural Roman citizens. Moving to modern France. Now, this is an accurate picture of France, and we've got two French people, at least two, this conference. So you can ask Leo and Thomas if this is actually a correct representation of their country. But currently, I'm actually in the process of applying to become a naturalized French citizen. And that's so that I can vote in the country in which I live. And when I was completing this process, I stumbled upon a booklet that the French state actually produced in order to give people instructions and guidance about how they can easily become a French citizen. What do you need to do? And amongst other things, they actually talk about what they call principles and values, that you need to uphold what they believe in if you want to be an actual French citizen. And along with that, you need to have a knowledge of French history. You need to be able to speak French. You need to be able to support democracy, to support the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and to understand and uphold la laïcité, which is essentially the separation of church and state. And if they're doing it correctly, if I don't support these values, these principles, this culture of the French Republic, they shouldn't let me in. That's how it should work. Or at the very least, I should look at this booklet and decide this community is not the one for me. This is a different culture to what I'm into. But how does this even apply to organizations? Why am I standing here talking about France? Well, essentially, as Ray Dalio says in his book, an organization is a machine consisting of two major parts: the culture and the people. When actually preparing for this talk, I was thinking, you know, I'm going to be stood in a room talking at people for, I don't know, half an hour or something. And you can look around the room. There's a lot of us here, but where is the culture? Can you point to it? Do you know how to describe it? And the thing is, you could ask 100 or 1,000 experts, people who consider that they know a lot about organizational culture. And more than likely, every single one would give you a slightly different definition. So I thought, how do I define it? That's something that I can talk about the easiest. And I would say that these two things give me a good idea of what culture is. Culture is how organizations do things. This is the one I use the most. It's the most succinct. And I think it just represents what it is very well. And culture is also consistent, observable patterns of behavior in organizations. And as Aristotle said, we are what we repeatedly do. So with these two, I hope you can have some further understanding of what I mean when I talk about organizational culture. Essentially, if you're working with an organization, or if you work in a company or even a team somehow, the patterns that you see crop up, the way that people behave, the unspoken rules of how people operate, that's the culture. And this is another very important point. That culture exists whether we like it or not. So whether you attend a lecture about organizational culture, whether you use the word culture or not, you're going to have a culture within your organization. In Anima, 25 years ago, when the group started, there was a culture. In Otwatklatki, 10 years ago, when they were starting, whether the Polish people used the Polish word kultura or not, they had a culture. So this means that we actually have, all of us, have a choice. We can either be part of an organization and help build this organization that has an undefined culture that we can't describe, that we can't therefore easily criticize, and that is harder to change. Or we can have a defined, observable, and therefore criticizable culture. And I will just apologize in advance. I'm going to say the word culture about 1,000 times in the next half an hour. Sorry. One of the other problems with culture when talking about it is that it really does highlight problems. One thing that I've found during my time in Anima International, at least, is when you start work, rather intense work on the culture in the organization, it is almost like you're taking a spotlight to the biggest problems in the organization that you couldn't even see or say before. So it makes it a very uncomfortable sometimes to go through. It can bring up problems. I actually think about it quite often as the, the Greek myth of the Hydra, where you cut off one of the monster's heads and two grow back in the same place. This is what it can feel like sometimes. And this is because you're usually, if you're anything like us, like our team, when you start talking about culture, you're going to have in-depth conversations about things that you may not agree on, that are probably fundamental to get right for your organization. And this can bring up some issues. Like, for example, I founded an organization in France, which is now part of Anima International. And it was actually during a discussion about our culture and values that we realized that one of the board members was not a fit for our organization. And luckily we removed this person after this discussion, and the team operates much smoother now. And this is just one example, of course. And this is again Ray Dalio. I think it's the last time I quote him. But he says that great cultures bring problems and disagreements to the surface and solve them well. And they love imagining and building great things that haven't been built before. Okay, so there's more Ray Dalio. This was something that also Jan talked about in his talk. About, this is actually what Ray Dalio calls looping. And you can think about it as, the upward trajectory of the success of your organization or even the success of your campaign. And instead of being a straight line, it's very much like this. You have a goal, you then fail, you learn from the failure, you improve, and then you set more goals. And in the end, it ends up looking like the spiral. Still an upward trajectory, but with some downward moments. And if you are part of an organization, maybe just take a look at this and think, where are you on this looping? Maybe you're on the high at the moment, or maybe you feel like you have hit rock bottom, but that's all part of the process. Culture is also difficult to get right. In 2007, I attended a concert by one of my favorite bands at the time, and they started playing one of their new songs. And I didn't like this song. I hated it. And I was so annoyed with them. Why are you wasting this time, this 5 minutes, to play this song that is not even good. And as I watched this and heard the song played live, afterwards, it was almost like something had just switched on in my brain. I just got it. And I think the similarity, the connection there may be a bit tenuous, but for me, this is often how I feel like when I'm talking to people about culture. It's almost like you can describe things. I can give a lecture right now. But the best way to get an understanding of what culture is to be involved in the creation or the problem solving or the crises that you have to go through. And then it's almost like hands-on experience. I would just briefly want to touch on what culture and values are not, because I think there are quite a few misconceptions. And the first thing is that culture, it is not a dogma. It is not something that you write down, you decide, and then you laminate it, stick it on the wall, and that's it. That's your culture. That's fixed all the problems, and it can never be changed. It should be something that is an ongoing process that your organization is thinking about constantly. And it should be criticizable and changeable where it makes sense. Sometimes it should be changed and improved. Having said that, I do think it's very easy to get stuck in the trap of thinking, oh, this is an inconvenient part of our culture, we'll just get rid of it for this year. It's best to really try your hardest to uphold the values that you want to see in society, and very rarely you can bend them. Culture is also not one size fits all. I'm not standing here telling all of you, this is our culture, this is what you need to do to have a successful group. It's going to be different for everyone. Every company in the world will have a different culture. It's the same for all of us here. What works in one country maybe won't work in another. So please remember that. It's not me telling you this is what you need to do. And part 2, we're going to talk very briefly about values and how they relate to culture. The moral principles and beliefs or accepted standards of a person or social group. That's one definition that I found. And the principles that help you to decide what is right and wrong and how to act in various situations. I wanted to give you a romantic example to try and illustrate what I mean when I say the word values. So I want you to imagine that you're dating someone new. You've met this new person, it's all very exciting, and you start spending more time with them. After, I don't know, 6 months, you move in together. After a year, you decide to get married. Following this, you realize that actually, while you personally have you find it very important to be individual, to have your freedom, and to be your own person. Whereas the other person, their goal in life is very much to have a family. That's what is important to them. And that's what they want from their life. Because you want to keep your freedom, however, you don't want kids. Similarly, you may feel very comfortable and think that what you need is to give each other the freedom, a high level of freedom, to trust each other because you've made this decision to be together. Whereas the other person, they may think, actually, the best way to have trust is to be entirely honest with each other, to never lie to each other and to tell each other everything. These two people, they're both good people. It's probably going to be harder, although not impossible, but much harder to have a successful relationship when you both have such different values. And applying this to organizations, it's very, very much, you can, agree to bind yourself with people, start an organization with someone, but if you haven't taken the time to think, do we have the same values? You may be in trouble later. It may be harder to operate. And how is this relevant to organizations? Our values, they have to reflect what makes us uniquely successful, conveying to everyone, this is what it takes to thrive here. So applying this romantic example to organizations can really help you improve the running of your groups. And it doesn't matter how small or large they are. This is something that we need to be thinking about. Now, I actually went through and thought, okay, I'm going to find some values that I can show the people from companies, organizations that they know. This first one is from Give Directly. They're the NGO who actually sends money directly to people living in poverty. And amongst their values, the first ones are recipients first, team next, be proactively candid, and create positive energy. So according to this, if we take it at face value, this is their values. This is the kind of thing to expect if you go to work at Give Directly. This is BP, the oil company, and they have different ones. They've got live our purpose, play to win, and care for others. I will let you be the judge whether they're doing that correctly. But I just wanted to show you that this is the same for whether you're an organization, a company, a group, a collective. You need to have values that you agree on. Now, looking at Open Philanthropy, they only have 4, which is interesting. For them, the values that are the most important are ownership, openness, calibration, and inclusiveness. And finally, for Netflix, I don't know if you've seen this, but actually Netflix spends a lot of time talking about culture with their employees, and they actually, during the onboarding process, they give a presentation about the culture, which I don't know, I think it's maybe 100 slides long or something. But 5 of the things that they find the most important for you to thrive in Netflix is to encourage decision-making by the employees, so not the leadership. Share information openly, broadly, and deliberately. Communicate candidly and directly. Keep only our highly effective people, and avoid rules. If you go to this page, you can just type in Netflix culture jobs, something like this. They've got a really long page. They spend a lot of time thinking about this. And this isn't me saying these are the values that you need to have. This is simply, this is how it plays out in the real world. These groups, these companies, they're spending the time thinking about this. And how do values actually relate to culture? I've talked about 2 different things there, culture and values, but how do they connect? I've started using this phrase that culture is values in action. And I put together this very sophisticated design where you can think of it as a pyramid. On the bottom, you've got the people. They're the foundation of everything that you do. And the people decide the values. They bring what is important to them to work every day. This is the kind of organization that we want to live in. And upon the values, that's what creates the culture. That's what creates how people feel when they work in the organization. Or to put it a different way, looking at our example, you've got first everyone in Anima International. On top of that, our beliefs and principles, and then how we interact with each other. So what about AI's values? We're still working on this. It's not a comprehensive list. And we still have a lot of work to do on alignment, maybe even just criticizing them. But these are the top 4 that we currently have. The first is working in the organization's and the team's best interests. Then cost effectiveness, intellectual rigor, and meritocracy. So these are things you can probably guess that we think are important. We have about 23 of them. We have spent a lot of time thinking about this, but as I said, this is not the same thing as saying it's spread entirely, perfectly throughout the organization. I mentioned earlier, but working with culture and values, it's a lifetime job. It's something you have to constantly work on. I wanted to give you some idea of things you could read if you wanted to delve more into this subject. And the first I would recommend is No Rules Rules. This is written by the CEO, I believe, of Netflix, and Erin Meyer, who's a researcher. I highly recommend this book. They talk a lot about culture, about giving feedback, critical feedback, about being radically honest with your team. And to be honest, it's just a fun read. It's written in a very engaging way. Second, I would also advise checking out Principles by Ray Dalio. I quoted from Ray a lot during this presentation, and to be honest, his book is really long. And even I read a lot of books, and even I couldn't get through it. I recommend just reading the second half. I mean, unless you're really interested in learning how he became a billionaire, which, to be honest, is really interesting. But the second half, he talks a lot and focuses on the principles that he's developed. This is kind of another word that I could use. You could switch out for values. And finally, I would recommend the Culture Code. I would recommend this slightly less, though. It's a good read. It talks a lot about building cultures in groups. This was actually where I took the Marshmallow example from. So yeah, you can check these 3 out if you're interested in learning more. But I wanted to just quickly go back to marshmallows for a second. Because recently we had a gathering for all our activists in Anima International. And I actually had people complete the Marshmallow Challenge. And my aim, at least, other than seeing people look very stupid, was to try and give people real-world practice of seeing how group culture actually does play into success. And to be honest, it's just a fun game. And during this challenge, I mean, it was a roller coaster of emotions, if I'm honest. And we had things like pride. Pride from the team was very important. Extreme concentration to a worrying level. Unfortunately, there was some defeat, some failure. Suspense. And finally, triumph. This is a picture of Lena, who was actually in the winning team. And I would just add that none of our people built one bigger than the kids. Group culture, as I've tried to explain and describe to you all, is extremely difficult to describe. It's very hard to get right. And yet, at the same time, it is one of the most important and neglected areas that we deal with. If we take the time to look into this, to invest in learning about it for our organizations, it can really help us be part of to create a global movement, to work together to further animal liberation. mean, every single person in this room is here because they know that animals deserve better. The same can be said for everyone watching at home. We need to make the effort to make that change, to learn about culture and values and talk about it in our organizations. I want everyone to know where they're going and why we're here. And that is something that having a clearly defined and efficient, effective culture can help us do. Now, I've spoke a lot today, almost exclusively, about people, about organizations, about concepts and ideas. But I will never forget that the reason why I do what I do is for her. And I really just want to take the time to thank all of you for caring enough to do this with me. We can do this. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Kirsty. That was a great talk. So now you can ask your questions to Kirsty through the app, of course.
Did anyone count how many times I said the word culture or not?
Let's say if we had to do shots, we'd be pretty drunk.
Okay, I'll see you tonight then for that.
Actually, still waiting for questions. Just wanted to ask first myself. What has been your biggest kind of aha moment? Because you were talking before, you had this aha moment with culture within, like, not even an Anima International, but like within working in other organizations.
Trying to think of a good example to share with you. I think one of the main moments was, like, as I described, this time where with the French board, because it was almost too good to be true to literally be on a call, going through the values, talking about culture, and having someone react so badly that it was almost like a joke. That it was almost like, how did we not see this before? That we're just not compatible. So this was interesting because, you know, I've been doing this for a long time, and still I didn't know about organizational culture. I mean, unless you look for it and want to actively learn about it, it's quite a dry subject. Yeah, quite a geeky subject, I would say. And being able to be in the movement for so long, being part of different organizations, creating my own, and not even thinking about this, it was quite shocking to me to think, how have we got so far, not even knowing about this? So yeah, this was an aha moment for sure.
Thank you. We have another question. Which of Anima International's core values do you have the most doubt about?
I'm not sure if it's doubt, but one of the ones that I find to be the most difficult, or the one that maybe could cause a lot of controversy, if not done correctly, is this, what we call radical honesty. And this is also taken from Ray Dalio, by the way. And that's this idea that you want to create a culture where people trust each other enough that they know people are not playing games, that it's, if someone tells you you did a good job, then that means you did a good job, and you don't have to think, what do they actually mean? Does this mean this really? And what if they said this to me next week? And it's taking things being able to take things very much at face value. And to be honest, if you can do this well, it's very refreshing because it's exhausting to play these games. We've got hard enough things to deal with anyway, rather than playing games in our own organizations. So being able to just completely forget about that is very refreshing, but also it's not for everyone. So I think you need to have a certain ability to firstly be honest, very honest with people. That means giving feedback, including critical feedback, and then also being able to accept that yourself. So if you do fuck up, someone's going to tell you, and sometimes that can be hard to hear. And I'm still learning now how to take criticism in the best way possible that can actually help you grow. So it's not one that I have the most doubt about, but it's one that I have the most doubt about how to effectively implement it.
Thank you. Next question. How do you go about choosing values for international organizations, taking into account social norms in different countries?
Yeah, so we have 6 countries across Europe, ranging from Ukraine to Denmark, everything in between. So the cultures within those countries are quite different. I would say that you can probably get ones that are more different. But for sure, we have to constantly think about how to manage this. I think, for example, my experience of being British and working with a lot of Polish people is that Polish people are really direct. And that can be quite jarring at first. But once you realize, oh, actually, that's just the way it is in Poland quite often, you can deal with it easier. So in terms of creating them when you work internationally, the way that we did the creation of ours currently, it took a lot of time, actually. That's probably one thing you need to think about. It's an investment. But and this is going to sound really obvious, but we sat down and took the time to think what is important to us. What kind of organization do we want to be? And if someone joins us today, how do we want them to feel? And, things came out of that, like being a place of psychological safety, being truth-seeking, compassionate, and so on. I mean, as I mentioned, there is quite a list, but once we had this list, we then narrowed it down. We made descriptions for every single one of those values. We did that with multiple people across multiple teams. We tried to criticize them and think, how can this be misinterpreted? How can this be improved? We also strangely tried to write them in quite a punchy way. So in quite an in-your-face way, so that it can get people excited. Because, I mean, I've mentioned before, but this can be a really dry subject. I'm not stood here talking about, rebelling against companies and how to get wins and, all the fun stuff. And yet it's still as important. So I would recommend, if you're new to this or if you want to begin having this conversation, it can be as simple as just getting a pen and paper and thinking, okay, what is important to us? Like maybe risk-taking is really important to your organization or your company. It's probably more relevant to startups, for example. But yeah, you need to clearly understand your organization and then start honing it, start writing it down and actually talking about it with the people you work with.
Thank you. So I'm going to do a couple more. What would you do if you realize that your values differ very much from those of the organization you currently work for? Would you try to discuss them and change them for the better, or would you look for another relationship to use your example?
Yeah, actually, this has happened to me in real life. I used to work for another organization who had very different values to what I felt were important. For example, I even became more so, but it was very important to me to as multiple people have been saying this weekend, to actually know that what we're doing is working, or at least make the effort to find out. And where I was working, I felt that this isn't what we're doing. We're just trying to make as much noise as possible. And it could get very demotivating. So it wasn't for me. I think for many people, it's probably the greatest job in the world. It wasn't the one for me. So I worked there for 4 years. I have learned a lot. I don't regret it, but I'm extremely glad I moved on, and I'm extremely glad I made the decision to find my people, because they were not my people. And I can tell you from experience that the difference in how you feel talking to colleagues when you're in the right culture, the one for you, it's insane. It makes every difference in the world.
Thank you. So how do you check with staff if they are aligned with your culture values?
Yeah, this is a hard one because, as I mentioned, we don't know if we're fully aligned yet. I think we're making really good progress, especially in the last year. I can see shifts happening and it just feels different. But if I'm honest, the best way is to go through hard times together. So, for example, you can and you should sit down with your people and talk about this and see if maybe people are misunderstanding it, maybe they have a different point of view. Maybe someone can convince you that this is ridiculous, what you're doing is stupid. But the best way to find out, are we aligned? Am I aligned with my team, in my experience, is to go through a very difficult point in your organization's history and come out the other side. Because it's almost like you're being forced to live those values and that culture or not. And you either see under that pressure, like the diamond either cracks or it doesn't. So I'm not here saying I suggest you go out and find emergencies and crises and to test your culture, but we all have these moments, these difficult points in time, and this is where you need to have your eyes open even more and think, how are people reacting? Am I living by the values that we want to see?
Thank you. Maybe two more. So if there are many cultural misalignments with a group, how do you start fixing the problems and creating cohesion?
Yeah, I'm not going to lie and say it's easy. I think it's extremely difficult. One of the best ways, I think, would be to, and again, it sounds obvious, but to understand what your values are, because at least in Anima International, we had a period of time, maybe about 2 years, where we were trying to align on culture and values, but we didn't have the language to talk about it. We didn't really know what values were, what is organizational culture, is it important? We were trying to solve the problem without having the tools, essentially. So I think one of the best ways is probably to maybe just start with reading the books that I've mentioned and getting yourself very clear on what you think, and then start talking to people. And again, one of the best ways is just being very observant and seeing how people react in real time. And maybe you can even find out that you're not the right person for the organization. Maybe it's just you that's not the fit. Everything's possible. But we can't get there until we actually start talking about it.
I think it might be the last one. Let's see. Okay, so will you elaborate more on your thoughts about culture change? When should an employee's different values result in a change in an organization's culture and values? And when is it better to realize the employer is not a good fit within the organization?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, it's really hard to describe. And quite often people, when I bring up this list of values, people think that these are the rules. This is Anima International, you can never do anything against this, and that's it. And I really want to get across to you that that is not what I'm saying. some of the values contradict each other. And that's life. Like, life contradicts things that we do. We contradict each other. So it's a constant rebalancing of, is this the priority? Are we balancing things correctly for what we need now? And I don't think it's important if, for example, people in the organization have different political views, if they like different music. To be honest, it can even work if you have a different ideas for what strategy you should be following. But when you realize that actually we don't have the same value of truth-seeking, because everything else is built on, for example, this value, I don't think it would be possible. So I think you need to have a difference between what is a value and what is an opinion. And it's a very subtle difference. I hope what I'm saying is making some sense to you, but it's very nuanced. That's the word I'm looking for. And I don't know, if you want to talk about it at longer length, whoever you are, come and find me and we can geek out about culture together.
Thank you. So yeah, that was the last question. Thank you, Kirsty, for your talk, and please, round of applause.